In 1910, a family of 6 lived in one room on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The room was 11 feet wide. They paid $4 a month for it, and by the standards of their neighbors, they were doing fine. 5 a.m., the room wakes up. There is no morning light. The one window in this room faces a brick wall 14 inches away. In the winter, which this is, the gray arrives slowly. Not sunrise, just a gradual softening of the dark. It's enough to see by. It has to be. The room is 11 feet wide and 13 feet deep, 143 square feet. In this room, an iron bed frame where Marco and Lucia Conti sleep. A second mattress on the floor where the 4 children sleep. Rosa, age 12, Antonio, age 9, little Enzo, age 6, and the baby Maria, who is 14 months and still wakes twice in the night. Marco is already up. He's been awake since 4:30, lying still so he doesn't wake Lucia, listening to the building come alive around him. Through the thin walls, a baby crying 2 rooms over, a man coughing, the deep, wet cough that's been going for 3 weeks, footsteps on the stairs. The building contains 47 people. It was built for 20. He's 34 years old. He came from a village outside Naples 8 years ago with $11 in his coat lining and the address of a cousin in Brooklyn written on a piece of paper. The cousin had moved by the time he arrived. Marco found work anyway. He dresses in the dark, same clothes as yesterday, same clothes as the day before. He has 2 shirts. He wears each one until it needs washing, then switches. He leaves without waking anyone. The stairs are dark. He knows exactly which step creaks, the 4th from the bottom. He steps over it. He has stepped over it every morning for 3 years. 5:30 a.m., the street. Mulberry Street at 5:30 in the morning in February 1910. It is not quiet. This is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The Lower East Side of Manhattan holds more people per square mile than any neighborhood in any city in any country in the world at this moment in history. More than Bombay, more than Shanghai, more than anywhere. And it sounds like it. Even at 5:30, the street is moving. Pushcart vendors are setting up, their wheels on the cobblestones making a specific grinding sound Marco could identify blindfolded. Icemen making early deliveries, a horse pulling a milk wagon, men walking in the same direction Marco is walking, toward the docks, toward the factories, toward wherever the work is today. Marco works at a garment factory on the 6th floor of a building on Green Street. He's been there 14 months. Before that, a tannery. Before that, ditch digging for a water main project. Before that, whatever was available. The garment factory is the best job he's had in America. It is not a good job. He walks 40 minutes to get there, both ways, every day. That's an hour and 20 minutes of walking. He doesn't count it as time. It's just the distance between the room and the work. The factory floor is the size of half a city block. 240 workers at tables arranged in rows so tight that Marco has to turn sideways to reach his station. Mostly women, young Italian and Jewish women, who work the machines with a speed that still impresses him after 14 months. Marco works the cutting tables. His job is to cut fabric to pattern all day with large shears that leave a blister on his right hand that has not fully healed in 6 months. The workday begins at 6. It ends at 6. 12 hours, 6 days a week. Here is what Marco earns: $8 a week. This is above average for an unskilled immigrant worker in 1910. The women at the sewing machines make between $3 and $6, depending on their speed. The men who sweep the floor make $4.50. Marco's $8 is considered in this world a living wage. He knows this. He is grateful for it with a gratitude that has a very specific, tired quality. The gratitude of someone who knows exactly what the alternative looks like. Lucia's morning. Back in the room on Mulberry Street, Lucia is awake. She's 30 years old and has been in America for 4 years. Her English is functional, better than Marco's, because she talks to more people during the day. She learned it from the women in the building, from the market vendors, From the settlement house on Henry Street where she took a class for 3 months before the baby came and she couldn't leave anymore. The morning begins with the baby. Maria needs feeding, changing, settling. This takes 45 minutes. While Maria nurses, Lucia is already planning the day in her head. The marketing, the cooking, the mending pile that has been growing on the chair for a week. Rosa's school blouse that needs a button, the rent due Friday. The rent is $4 a month for the room. No kitchen, there is a shared coal stove on each floor used by all the families on that level. No private toilet, there are 2 outhouses in the building's backyard shared by all 47 residents. No bath, the public bathhouse on Orchard Street costs 3 cents, and Lucia takes the children on Saturdays when Marco is at work and they can't make noise in the room. She makes coffee on the shared stove. Real coffee, not chicory. This is one of the things she will not give up. 15 cents a week for coffee. Some of the women on her floor think this is wasteful. Lucia doesn't discuss it. Breakfast is bread and coffee for everyone. The bread she buys from the bakery on the corner, 2 cents for a large loaf. She could bake, but the shared stove is difficult, and the other women have their own schedules, and there are conflicts she has learned not to start. Rosa eats quickly, helps Lucia with the younger children's faces and hands, and leaves for school at 7:30. Public school, 2 blocks away, free. This is one of the things about America that Lucia believes in completely and without reservation. The school is free, and they let her children in, and the teachers are patient with the ones who are still learning English. Antonio goes too. Enzo starts in September. 9 a.m., the market. Lucia takes the baby and walks to the market. Hester Street on a weekday morning is one of the wonders of this city that nobody from outside the neighborhood ever sees. Push carts stretching for blocks, vegetables, fish, bread, pickles in barrels, fabric remnants, second-hand clothing, pots and pans, everything imaginable sold from wooden carts by men and women shouting in 6 languages simultaneously. Lucia moves through it with the efficiency of someone who has done this every day for 4 years and knows every vendor by face, if not by name. She buys potatoes, 2 cents a pound, she gets 3 pounds. Herring, salted, from the barrel, 2 cents each, she gets 4. Onions, a penny for a large bunch. Bread she already has. A small piece of beef bone for soup, 3 cents, from the butcher at the end of the row who gives her the bone with more meat on it than she pays for because she has been a customer for 3 years, and she always pays on time. Total spent, 14 cents. She has $1.20 for the week's food, 14 cents today. The rest calculated out across 7 days in her head, adjusted daily based on what's fresh, what's cheap, what the children need most. This calculation runs in the background of every other thought she has. It never stops. 11 a.m., the room in the morning. Back in the room, the baby is asleep on the mattress. Lucia makes soup. The bone goes in a pot with water and the onion and 2 of the potatoes. It will cook for 2 hours. The smell fills the room and drifts into the hallway, and other doors open briefly and close again. While the soup cooks, she mends. The mending pile is never finished. There is always something, a tear, a worn elbow, a missing button, a hem that has come down. Rosa's school blouse gets the button first, then Antonio's trousers, which have a hole at the knee that she patches with a piece of fabric cut from a shirt that has worn through beyond saving. Nothing is thrown away. Every piece of fabric becomes something else before it becomes a rag. And rags become cleaning cloths, and cleaning cloths become, eventually, when they are truly finished, nothing. But that takes years. She works by the window that faces the brick wall 14 inches away. In the gap between the buildings, a strip of gray sky. She has learned to see weather in that strip. The quality of the light tells her if it will rain. This morning, the strip is pale and flat, no rain. From through the wall, she can hear Mrs. Kessler next door talking to her daughter in Yiddish. Lucia understands more Yiddish than she speaks. She learned it the same way she learned everything in America, by listening, by necessity, by the slow accumulation of patterns.
12 p.m.
What the children eat. Rosa and Antonio come home at noon. Lunch is soup. The bone soup, now dark and rich, ladled over the remaining potatoes. 4 portions. Lucia eats less than she serves. The bread torn into pieces and put in the bowl to soak up the broth. Nothing left in the pot when they're done. Antonio tells a story about a boy at school who got in trouble for something. Rosa corrects his English while he tells it. Not cruelly, just automatically. The way she's been doing for 2 years because her English is better and she knows it matters. Antonio argues. Lucia lets them argue for exactly as long as she can stand it, and then says one word in dialect and they stop. This is lunch, 20 minutes, then back to school. Lucia washes the bowls in the hallway sink, cold water only, shared by the whole floor. She dries them with a cloth and puts them on the shelf. The shelf has 4 bowls, 4 cups, 1 pot, 1 pan, 3 spoons, 2 forks. Everything they need, nothing they don't. 3 p.m. Rosa comes home early. Rosa is home at 3, not 4. She finished her assignments in school and the teacher let her leave early. Or this is what she tells Lucia. Lucia suspects Rosa left on her own, but doesn't press it. Rosa is 12. She is the most American of the children. She thinks in English now, Lucia can tell, because sometimes she has to translate back to answer in Italian. Rosa sits with Lucia while Lucia finishes a hymn. They talk. This is one of the things about Rosa that Lucia stores carefully, the talking. Rosa talks to her like a person, like someone whose opinion matters. In the village in Italy, a daughter didn't do this. In Italy, Lucia was a daughter who didn't do this. America makes different daughters. 6 p.m. Marco comes home. Marco is home at 6:40, the 40-minute walk after 12 hours on the cutting floor. He comes in and the children move toward him. Not dramatically, not running, just a gravitational drift, the way they always do. Enzo grabs his hand. Maria reaches from the mattress. Marco picks her up and she grabs his face with both hands and he lets her. Lucia has made dinner from the afternoon, the herring fried in a small amount of lard in the pan, with the last potato cut thin and fried alongside. Bread. The coffee, reheated from this morning and stretched with hot water.
The bread.
They eat together on the mattress and the floor because there is no table. There is no room for a table. This is simply how it is and has been, and they have stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing the sound of a city when you've lived in it long enough. Marco tells Lucia about the factory. A small thing, a funny thing, something a man at the next table said. He edits the day into something that can be told at dinner without worrying her. She does the same. She doesn't tell him about the money calculations she did this afternoon, the one that has room for Rosa's school if nothing goes wrong. She'll tell him when she knows more, when there's something specific to say. After dinner, Marco sits with Antonio and helps him with his arithmetic. Marco's arithmetic is good. He learned it in Italy, and numbers translate cleanly across languages. Antonio is good too. Marco watches him work through a problem, and something moves in his face that he doesn't let out. 9 p.m., the room at night. The children are asleep by 8:30. All 4 of them on the mattress on the floor. Rosa and Antonio back to back. Enzo curled against Antonio, the baby in the middle where she can't roll off. They sleep the deep sleep of children who have been cold and moving all day and are now warm and still. Marco and Lucia sit on the bed in the near dark. 1 candle, kerosene costs money, candles are cheaper, and they've learned to need less light. They talk quietly so they don't wake the children. 11 p.m., what doesn't sleep? The building doesn't fully sleep. Someone's baby, the man with the cough, footsteps, a night shift worker leaving at 11, another coming home. The street below, the city that runs on a schedule that doesn't match daylight. Marco lies awake for a while. He survived it. That's the word that fits. Here's what he knows at 11 o'clock night in February, 1910, lying on an iron bed in a room 11 feet wide with his wife and 4 children and everything they own. He has a job. The rent is paid. The children are eating. Rosa wants to stay in school, and there might, if nothing goes wrong, be room for that in $8 a week. This is not the life he imagined when he left Naples. It is the life he has. And it is, by the specific, narrow, hard-won standards of this building, this street, this city in this year, enough. He closes his eyes. The radio through the wall plays something he doesn't know the name of. He listens to it until he can't anymore. In 1910, 1.6 million people lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the most crowded places in human history. They came from Italy, from Russia, from Poland, from Hungary, from everywhere that was harder than here, which was almost everywhere. They lived in rooms 11 feet wide and called it a start. They learned the language one word at a time and called it progress. They put their children in the free school and called it the whole point. Their children's children built the country that forgot how small the room was. It's worth remembering, the room was very small, and what came out of it was very large.